we're going to get started, and while I'm not usually into being politically correct, or any correct, I do want to pretend that I'm a college professor today and issue a trigger warning. We're going to be visiting the cemetery where all the poor folks are dead, but some people were more reluctant than others, and some of the stories we'll hear are kind of sad, and at least one is very sad. Just letting you know, I'm not going to be making my usual number of stupid, jokey remarks. The other thing is, when we first put this tour together a few years ago, what I was aiming to do was show a particular time period of town. The cemetery was, the Villlage Cemetery was opened after the Civil War and after the completion of the church in 1877. And it was built as a modern cemetery. And by the end of the 19th century, what that meant was it was a place that would be beautifully landscaped and welcoming for people to come and visit. It never quite reached the level of the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, which is incredibly well landscaped, or the Forest Hill Cemetery, where some of my ancestors are buried, which actually welcomes people today to walk through with their dogs, unusual for most cemeteries, because it has the aspect of a beautiful park. Prior to that, and I guess we can start walking while I talk. Cemeteries over the years had changed quite a bit. In the 18th century, sometimes they were called graveyards or even boneyards, and the cemetery was often located right next to the one and only Congregational church. Remember that everybody in New England was supposed to be a Congregationalist until 1831. That was the official established church. And the theory was that you would build a graveyard and you'd put up headstones with skulls on them and remind everybody that they were going to die. And most of you were all going to go to hell. And the idea there was to try to promote a conversion experience. If you could testify in the church that you had been saved, then people apparently were willing to take your word for it. But those early graveyards, while are attractive to us today because they're really the only art from the early colonial period, especially here in Easton, where we were relatively poor, they were meant to terrify people, unless they made a mistake. You know, they would oftentimes have an hourglass, and the hourglass would have a motto under it that said, "My glass is run," you know, meaning your time is run out. But there's at least one where there was a typo and it says, "My glass is rum." Which is only my second favorite. Well, actually, I have another one. My two favorite epitaphs are, "I told you I was sick," and the third one was actually from Boot Hill in Tombstone, Arizona, and that says, "Less more, shot by a .44, no less, no more." When the Ameses came to town, there was a series of little ponds going back in this direction, which they used for a variety of small shops. And this lane that's next to it is actually a street in Easton called Hoe Shop Street, or Hoe Shop Lane, because it led to the hoe shop. It also led to the Ames's squash court, which is further down and back. This area over here to the right, where the cemetery is now, was sort of unused land. And the reason it was unused is that it was loaded, like Borderland State Park, with glacial erratics, large stones that were dropped off by the glacier. And underneath, not terribly felicitous for a graveyard, was a lot of ledge. But it fitted with the church, and so a cemetery was built here. Now, as some of you probably know, a lot of the Ameses had already shuffled off by the time the cemetery was opened. And basically what happened was the family was collected from various other graveyards. John Ames from West Bridgewater, Captain John, the so-called founder of shovel making. He made the shovels that were supposedly used at Bunker Hill. And then Oliver had been buried down in, my God, the South Easton Cemetery. And Oakes was down there as well, so they were brought back. And of course, being the prominent family in town and the founders of the cemetery, they were buried on top of the hill. That's going to be the last place we're going to go, because what I'd like to explore today is some of the other people and how in the time period after the Civil War, they influenced the growth of the town. So let's go this way. This is Napoleon Bonaparte Dayna, which I met a few years ago when I was researching the very, very first subscription library in town. And Napoleon here was living in South Easton with the Dean family, who owned the old Dean Mill and the Dean Machine Shop. And at age 21, he subscribed 50 cents to the new library. And over the course of 2 years, he took out 3 books. So he wasn't much of a reader. But he started off first in a cotton factory in town, probably the Morse factory, then became a machinist with the Deans and married the boss's daughter, Elizabeth H. Dean. But interestingly enough, what happened to him in the long run was that he changed professions, moved up to Center Street, where his house still stands, and became a butcher, which doesn't sound like a promotion, going from a machinist, which we kind of consider to be a high-tech job today, to being a butcher, which is sort of an old-timey kind of a job. But as I think we'll learn, the idea of using Easton as a place to process meat that would then be shipped to Boston was sort of a big deal at the time. People thought they could make a fair amount of money out of that, particularly after the railroad arrived in town. So he made a good choice and ended up being able to buy this monument here. Although I should warn you that Mr. Chaffin, our first historian, had a very dry sense of humor, and he called gravestones monumental falsehoods, because they were monuments and some of the information on them were completely false, like, beloved of. Sometimes they weren't that beloved. But this one's a pretty straightforward one.
Did you say Napoleon Bonaparte?
Napoleon Bonaparte Dayna, yes. In the early part of the 19th century, people departed from that wonderful old Yankee tradition maintained by my family and the Ameses to, name the next kid along after somebody had already been in the family. So thank God I didn't get either Carville or Alva, which were my 2 grandparents. I got my grandfather's middle name, which is bad enough, as Edmund. Couldn't be Edward, darn it. Or David, which is what my mother wanted to name me. So people began to name their sons and daughters after famous people. And as novel reading became much more popular, oftentimes they were named after people in novels. Buried around the corner here, we'll probably walk past the grave, is Kay Fitton. Kay sounds like a girl, but it's not. It's a man. He was a shovel maker, and Kay was the name of Sir Kay from the Walter Scott stories of the Middle Ages. So
he's not an exile or something like that.
He's not an exile. No, he was exiled from Canton, but.
And what was the time frame of Napoleon Bonaparte?
Napoleon Bonaparte was, when he was born in 1821, Bonaparte, I believe, was still alive but in exile on St. Helena, soon to die. In fact, he may have actually died in 1821. It's about that time frame. But Bonaparte was finished ruling the world at that point. No, it's not one of his silent offsprings. The Bonapartes did make it to America, and one of his sons or nephews lived out his life in New Jersey, but not here in Easton. We were just stuck with the Ameses. Now, we all think of Easton as shovel town, and that's relatively true. The shovel works was probably the biggest single employer in town in the era after the Civil War, but not by much, and not perhaps in total, because there were lots and lots and lots of people who were in the shoe industry, and George Andrews was one of these people. George is important for a couple of reasons. He, as you can see, was a veteran. He was a veteran of the Civil War, and he was a first lieutenant in Company A of the 7th Massachusetts Regiment. And that was significant because the 7th Mass was the #1 unit that had the most people from Easton in it. And even more important is that just recently we have begun to get some of his letters. No, the Postal Service didn't delay them that long, but one of his descendants is being very generous in giving us a lot of his artifacts, including photographs. He was a founder of the Grand Army of the Republic Hall here in Easton, and he sent a letter home once a week for the 3 years that he was in the service. And we believe that that's going to answer a lot of questions about our men serving in the Civil War. We don't have a very strong Civil War collection. Very few letters have survived. And if we ultimately get this collection, we'll put it together and you'll have a record that'll answer some of the questions. You know, these people that are here have secrets. And one of the secrets is whether his commander, the captain of the unit, was a coward or not. There's some indication that when the boys came home in 1864, the local newspaper mentioned that one of the officers was noted for never appearing in battle. And we think it may be Captain Foster, the captain of this unit. And perhaps Mr. Andrews' letters will tell us. We already have an indication from the regimental history that in the very first battle they were in, the captain was so fat he couldn't keep up with the other men, and so they passed on to the front while he was sitting on a rock huffing and puffing. Later, George Andrews mentions that the captain was unavailable for battle because he was solving that weight problem. He had a terrible case of dysentery and was not available for that battle. So in the two battles we know about, the captain wasn't available, which meant that George Andrews was the man in charge of leading our men, a very important person. It's also nice to know that we have pictures of him. We have so few pictures of people from this era that are actually identified. I want to go over here and show you a very unusual gravestone. This is probably the biggest gravestone in Easton. This is one of those glacial erratics that I was talking about, and just from a geologist's point of view, you can look at it and see all these scratch marks. And those scratch marks are from when it was rolling around inside of the glacier up against other rocks. In some of the rocks in town, these lines align properly, which is north to south, which is the direction the glacier was moving. But cleverly, the Meter and Swain family, Mr. Meter was a very, very wealthy man who was born in Nantucket and came to Easton shortly after the gold rush. We don't know why, other than the fact that he was sort of a marketer, and he sent his son out to California. The son became involved in mining, and I was reading a newspaper article yesterday about the fact that the son continued in the mining business after the gold rush was over and went to Butte, Montana, where there was a lot of mining as well. But what would somebody from Easton be involved in marketing for the gold rush? Shovels. So he was working very, very closely with the Ames family. His son John, his son-in-law John married obviously his daughter, and they both lived on Main Street in the houses that are still there across the street, and we'll talk about them when we take that particular tour. If you feel a rumbling underneath your feet, Mr. Meter and Mr. Swain used their money because they were very faithful people. He was actually, Mr. Meter, as a quick aside, was a very morally obligated man. He helped the Ameses sell Union Pacific stock and bonds, and when the company went bankrupt, he actually paid back all the people he had convinced to buy the bonds. So there's no record of the Ames family doing that. So I thought that was very straightforward. And also, he was convinced, as was his son-in-law, convinced Methodist. And what they did is, again, in sort of conjunction with the Ames family, you may remember that the Methodist Church was located on the Rockery site, and then the Unitarians took it over. In 1864, the two of them paid for the building of the new Methodist Church, which is now the Tony Ship restaurant, which I don't think they would appreciate very much. I just say them the way they're spelled, and it's not a silent E if it's in the middle. I'm sorry. So it's a Tony Ship for me, which may explain why this looks so dark and dreary, because it's no longer a church. The Methodists moved out many years ago. Followed by the Swedes, followed by King Music Company, and now it's a restaurant. The highest ranking military officer we ever had was Rear Admiral George Francis Faxon Wilde. And for somebody like me who was born in Braintree, Faxon is an important name. The family comes from the Braintree area. Admiral Wilde came to town and married his wife, who was a Howard. And they lived in a house on Center Street, the one that's never painted, that house. And if you look carefully on the side by Oakland Avenue, you'll see a round window. That's the porthole window that marks Admiral Wilde's office. Okay. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1864, and I can't say Annapolis, because what happened when the Civil War broke out was the Naval Academy was moved to Newport, Rhode Island. So he graduated when it was at Newport, and was able, as a young officer, to get into some of the last naval battles of the Civil War. His career went all the way into the early part of the 20th century. He once captained the fastest ship in the Navy, an experimental ship called the Dolphin, and captained that all the way around in a round-the-world tour. So that was pretty spectacular. Even more spectacular was his service in the Spanish-American War, where he served on a ship that was a little old-fashioned. It was a ram. The idea was that this new ship was going to smash into the sides of other ships and sink them. Obviously, it was so obsolete as an idea that never happened, and he spent the early part of the Spanish-American War guarding harbors, Boston and New York in particular. And then he finally got an assignment in the Philippines. And one obituary notes that he got the nickname the Taker of Cities, because what he would do is he'd sail his ship around and take cities from the Spanish, not without too much effort because they had already surrendered, but that was his job. And he finally got the job of being on the #1 ship in the Navy, the battleship Oregon. And he was in the Philippines when he was ordered to very, very quickly go to China for the Boxer Rebellion. American Marines were in Beijing, and they were going to be retreating out of there, and they needed some defense. And Admiral Wilde steamed full speed ahead and ran into a rock and almost sank the battleship Oregon, which was our #1 ship. After that, he got a lot of shore duty. No blame was associated, but he never got a ship again. He did lighthouse work, and he was involved in naval education, served as the head of the Boston Navy Yard, et cetera, et cetera. And he finally retired in 1905 because his wife's health was failing, and which was true. It wasn't an excuse. But they both ended up dying 6 years later in the year 1911. So this is our highest ranking military officer, a Rear Admiral. He got promoted right at the end of his career for pension purposes, sort of like me. You'll see names around here that are familiar, like the Spooner graveyard, Spooner grave over here. The Spooners, obviously, Otis Spooner is the namesake for Spooner Street. And you'll see next to him the Sladen Reynoldses. And the Sladen Reynoldses were the people who owned a general store, which is now that little house right next to the gas station and next to the railroad cut on the other side of the street. We'll talk about that when we get there. That was probably the original Ames store and continued as a store into the 20th century with the Reynoldses. This is Josiah F. Goward Stone and his son, also Josiah C. Goward. And Josiah was sort of important. Because he was the guy that had the bright idea of being, well, it was actually his dad, had the idea of butchering cattle for a living. And basically what Goward decided to do was use the Industrial Revolution to his purposes. And what he did was he brought cattle at the Brighton Cattle Market in Boston, shipped them down to Easton on the railroad car, and then drove them down to his home base. Now, the home base is probably familiar to all of you. Once upon a time, there was a slaughterhouse there, and if you look very carefully, you can still see the cornerstones of that slaughterhouse. There was also a very large pond, very large but not very deep, that Mr. Goward used to make ice. So what he would do is he'd slaughter cows, and then he would freeze them with the ice, and then ship them out on the railroad again. Okay, you could also buy your own meat here in Easton from him. Now, where was that? Well, the answer was Frothingham Park. Frothingham Park, where the football field is located. I guess it's a stretch for some of you to remember there was a football field there, but there was. That was the pond, and the slaughterhouse was built closer to Center Street. Across the street was Goward's retail location, and that was for a long time a butcher shop done by the well, it was a butcher shop then. Now it's where you can go for not just tabbouleh, located there. That was also a carriage factory at one point. So Mr. Goward made a lot of money. And he was quick to invest in a number of projects. For instance, he decided to invest with a man named Hiram Williams, who's here someplace. We probably walked right by him. And Hiram was the man who owned most of the land that's now sheep pasture. And Hiram, obviously, as a successful farmer, had some extra money to spend. He had, as a young man, been a shoemaker, and they together opened a shoemaking company. This was after the Civil War, and if you don't know anything about the shoemaking business, what had happened was Brockton had made a fortune selling shoes to the Union Army during the Civil War, and then they used that money to mechanize their plants. So that gave them a leg up on all the surrounding communities. And by the time that Hiram and Mr. Goward were getting together, what they were planning to do was very old-fashioned, which was just build a big building and invite shoemakers to rent space, sort of like a barber shop. Come in, guys, and you can make your shoes here and have a roof over your head. So we don't think that that was terribly successful. He was much more successful in a partnership with a feed and grain dealer from Southeastern, a man named Lemuel Wilbur, who we'll talk about a little bit later when we visit his gravestone. What they did is they bought all the land between Columbus Avenue and Wilbur Street, and between Center and Sheridan Street, and turned it into the very first subdivision in Easton. and made lots of money on that without even building a lot of houses, because what they did was they would sell lots to George DeWitt, who's also buried here, and DeWitt would build the houses. This is the grave of Samuel A. Stroud and his wife, Sylvia Randall Stroud. Sylvia managed to get married several times, and but ended up being buried here, which was an issue in those days when husbands and wives would oftentimes die young and people would remarry. Who the heck are you going to be buried with? The first husband, the second husband, or as we'll see later on, both husbands. But she chose to be buried here with Samuel. She was married to him for the longest time. Sylvia was a Randall, and she was the sister of Joel Randall, who lived right where the church is located now. When the church was built, his house was moved. Okay? He's an important figure in the village because he was one of the first shovel workers, Joel was, to work with Ames, and had a long time, many decades, at the shovel works. And the guys that started with Old Oliver did very well. Okay, they earned a lot of respect in town. And Sylvia, I guess, was a character. She earned a lot of respect in town as well. And her son, Sanford, married Mary Melvina Torrey. Mary Melvina Torrey was the niece of Olivia Gilmore Ames. In other words, she was the niece of Congressman Oakes Ames, which worked out very well for the family because after the war was over, Sanford got a job as a carpetbagger. He became a postmaster in Evergreen, Alabama. Also important was that Aunt Sylvia's daughter married George DeWitt. And sadly, as we'll see eventually as we make the circle around, her son, Joel's son, Ansel, was the last Easton boy to die in the Civil War. And the family was very close, and the daughter DeWitt named her son Ansel DeWitt. Here's George over here. Oh, that's Guilford. Okay. The DeWitts and the Strouds both came down from up north. The Strouds came from Maine. DeWitt came from Canada. Here's Kay fitting right over here. Kay, for his entire working career, was a shovel maker. And you can see that if you were a consistent shovel maker, you could do a number of things. Number one would be buy a nice house, and number two, buy a very nice gravestone. So here he is buried here at the bottom of the hill. I do want to point out this gravestone. This is William Parks, and William Parks was the butler at Sheep Pasture. And he was the butler there for 40 years. Which basically was almost the entire life of the house at Sheep Pasture. He was an Englishman. All the out front servants at Sheep Pasture were either English or American. All the behind the scenes servants were Irish. So if you did the wash, you were Irish. If you answered the door, you were American or English. Except if you answered the door, if you were a footman who answered the door, your name was Henry. There was so much turnover at Sheep Pasture among footmen, they just decided to call all the footmen Henry. But Parks was there for 40 years and became one of these indispensable men, sort of almost like a member of the family. One of the nice things that he did was when Mrs. Parker got married, he dug out a newspaper clipping of when her parents got married and gave it to her because he had been with the family that long. His wife, Marie, was from France, and they had a daughter. And when Olivia Ames from Sheep Pasture enlisted in World War I as a nurse, the daughter also enlisted as a nurse. And obviously both England and France were fighting the Hun, and it must have had a very special meaning for this family when their daughter enlisted. As we get towards the back of the cemetery, you'll notice many more Swedish names. And that's because the cemetery opened in 1877 or 1878. And shortly thereafter, there was a gigantic, ginormous influx of Swedes into Easton. And I stop at this stone here, not because the person has any particular influence on Easton's history. He was a congregational minister who served in a number of places around the country, but decided to be buried here. And the family erected this stone. I've been told that this is much more like the ancient stones that were erected in Sweden for people's deaths. So it's certainly beautiful, and they did right by their ancestor. This is interesting. I don't know why Mr. Goward is buried up front and Mr. Wilbur is buried down back, and also Mr. and Mrs. Carr. The Carrs were the people that owned another big chunk of the sheep pasture property. Lemuel K. Wilbur came to Easton from Norton and built a house that's located on Depot Street. It's the house that has the ugly, peeling, orange painted barn with two little small mini houses next to it, and then the wonderfully taken care of main house. We don't know if Mr. Wilbur built that house or whether it was older. It seems to have a little bit of an older style. Wilbur was very successful. In fact, I've seen some indications that when he died in the beginning of the 20th century, he was probably the head of the second richest family in town after the Ameses. And of course, we still have Wilburs in town as well. Lemuel K. was a feed and grain guy, but he had big ambitions. He was one of the prime movers behind that subdivision in Northeastern, but he realized that it would be worth even more if it was connected. So he promoted a trolley line that went from Mansfield Center to Easton Center, and then that would hook up with the trolley line that went to Brockton. The trolley line wasn't terribly successful, but it lasted for a fair amount of time. Probably most importantly, as the big school bus for people who wanted to come from the Furnace Village area to go to high school. Wilbur was described as, let's see, a fine-looking man of ruddy complexion with a face betokening intelligence. He looks like one who would be slow to form an opinion, and having once formed it, would maintain it against all comers. That was a useful trait, because this description came from a description of the jury for Lizzie Borden. He was one of the 12 good men and true who found her innocent against all evidence that anybody's ever looked at since. Legend has it that if you go up to the attic, carved in the entry to the attic are the initials LBNG. Lizzie Borden, not guilty, because he would never admit that he made the wrong decision.
Where is that carved?
Supposedly in the way into the attic.
In
Easton, in the house in Easton. Oh, wow. Yeah. Now, if you go by that house and you see those two little buildings, the little buildings were the shacks that were moved along the trolley line as it was being built, and the workers, who were Italians, according to the story, were housed there as things moved along. Didn't look very comfortable, but that's where they lived. Okay. There was a huge distinction between people like Mr. Wilbur, who get buried on the rising ground, and people like the Ameses, who get buried on the really rising ground, and all the other folks who were kind of down below. It was a still pretty stratified society. Once upon a time, there was a Swedish immigrant named Alfred Eriksson, who came to Brockton and got a job at the Keith Shoe Factory. But he had been used to living outdoors, you know, on a farm in Sweden, and felt very, very confined to living in Brockton. So he came over here because there were Swedes here in Easton, and it was still kind of a wonderful farming community. And he eventually bought a plot here in the cemetery. Now, if we look for him today, we can't find him, and there's a reason for that. In 1909, he was involved in a horrible accident at the Keith shoe factory. He was killed in the basement by the machinery. Remember when for those of you who were on the tour of the shovel company, we talked about how the machinery was run and there were these huge belts that hooked onto shafts. And in those days, there was no government protection of workers, so they were completely exposed. And apparently Keith and Eriksson, in trying to repair that, got caught up in the machinery and was killed. He had married just a year before to a Swedish immigrant girl named Olga, who was a very pretty girl who was also a little on the fragile side. She had come to the United States in 1902. Her brother and sister came here as well, but instead of staying in the Brockton area, they went out to Illinois. And what happened was that their parents had both committed suicide. There was some history of instability in the family. Well, when Alfred died, obviously there was no special funds or government agencies to take care of them, and so the family looked like they were in a bad spot. Luckily, Olga had been working for Dr. Goddard, the man who established Goddard Hospital, and she was a much-loved person. She worked part-time at his private hospital and part-time with the family as sort of, a domestic. So things looked okay. Mr. Keith, who owned the shoe factory, went off about his business, thinking about running for Congress and running the city of Brockton and not really caring about Olga. And also the fact that Olga had one daughter, Gladys, who was born just before her father died, okay? Well, Olga went and visited with the relatives in Illinois after Alfred died, and just couldn't get her ex-husband, her deceased husband, out of her mind. So after a couple of years, she drifted back here, and Dr. Goddard was happy enough to take her back as an employee, and actually even let her live with them at the house. Sadly, she had begun to show signs of very, very deep depression, and Dr. Goddard recommended that perhaps the stress of having a young child, she was now 5 years old, was too much for her, and that maybe a little break by sending the girl to boarding school would be appropriate. And Olga said, "We will never be parted." Sadly, I think that was a precipitating event, because over the next few weeks, things went from bad to worse. In October, she visited with a friend and decided to drop off mementos with her, the only pictures of her and her daughter. And then one day she went to a florist in Brockton, got on the trolley, which ended right in front of the rockery, walked over here, put flowers in this general area here. There was no headstone. There was a mound of dirt where her husband had been buried. And then, after she did that, she and her daughter walked back to Langwater Pond, where Olga killed her daughter and threw her into Langwater Pond, and then jumped in herself and drowned, which is pretty horrible. The story is even more horrible, and you may have heard wonderful stories about this person, but it's always good to know that there's other sides to people. Dr. Goddard, when he heard that a body had been found in the pond, Gladys floated because she had been killed before she was thrown in. So there was no water in her lungs, so she floated. And a teamster pulled her out of the water. Dr. Goddard heard about it, came over and identified the body. And immediately people thought, oh my God, either she did something terrible or there's a crazed killer on the loose and we need to do something about this. So the district attorney got permission from John S. Ames to drain Langwater Pond to make it easier to recover the body of Olga. However, even that process got started and the water was going down when all of a sudden Mary Ames, soon to be Mary Ames Frothingham, appeared and said, stop, you're on private property, you can't do this, and besides, if you drain the pond, it'll smell bad. And so the police stopped draining the pond. John Ames, who had given permission, was out of town. He had been wired and had wired his permission. So nobody knew what to do. And they continued to drag the water with grappling hooks, and they eventually found her. No thanks to Mary. Mary, in a, shall we say, Trumpian moment, realized that she had made a huge bad move by saying, stop doing this. And said, oh no, I was misquoted in the paper. I meant that if you drained the pond, it would smell bad for all the neighbors, not just me. And that's the way the story was left. So here you have Olga, Gladys, and presumably Alfred all buried. And she kept her promise. She's never been separated from her daughter. So.
Why didn't Alfred get his name on here?
I think what happened, and I haven't been able to uncover the story, he was buried, and there's still a bear patch here. If you're into spooky stories, there's a bear patch. He was buried. They couldn't afford a headstone. These two died, and the town felt so bad that somebody erected this headstone, okay? You could speculate that members of either the Lindquist or the Prosper family, probably the Lindquists, might have been the people who did that. So there they are with, you know, I think a beautiful stone, but a tragic story, a very tragic story. So, we just uncovered this recently. We don't have a lot of murders in Easton, and that was one of them. So this is the grave of Reverend William Chaffin. He always makes me chuckle. I'll tell you why in a minute. So another nice big stone with a carving. This is Aunt Phoebe. Aunt Phoebe lived to be 100 years old, and she was one of the aunts that raised Reverend Chaffin when his parents died. So he tells the story that for the first 2 months of his life, he lived with Aunt Phoebe, and for the last 20 years of her life, she lived here in Easton. And Aunt Phoebe was really a character, very typical New Englander. She is actually old enough to remember the funeral of George Washington, and she wrote about that and talked about it. But she also didn't get married until she was 55. And they asked her, how come you waited so long? And she said, well, if I got a good one, I'd be rewarded for waiting. And if I got a bad one, I wouldn't have to live with him that long. Okay. She lived with the guy for 20 years before he passed away, even though he was substantially older than she was. And then she came here to live with Reverend Chaffin. So they asked her, are you going to be buried with your husband? And she said, oh no, I was the third wife. He already has one on the left hand and one on the right hand. I'm not going to be buried there. Okay. But her best line was, if heaven is as nice as Easton, I won't mind going. So that should be our slogan, I think. Reverend Chaffin was an interesting guy. He got the job here in Easton expecting to die. Ultimately, of course, he did. But he served as the minister of the church for 50 years, despite his imminent death. And what had happened was he had assisted a friend in moving furniture and apparently tore up muscles in his chest, which the doctors of the time diagnosed as heart disease. And he spent months recovering. And he always thought he was about to die. So he said, well, I'll take this job in this little town because the stress can't be bad. There's one sermon a week and not that many people to visit. And that's why he came here and became our town historian. He also was, as you can see here, a Civil War veteran. When the Confederates were in Pennsylvania, he enlisted in a temporary militia unit and chased around for the Confederates for a while, never ran into any of them, but he was wounded. He was on sentry duty one night and was really bored and was sticking his gun with his bayonet into a log when he missed and jammed the bayonet right through his toe. So he was a wounded veteran of the Civil War. He loved to tell that story and make everybody laugh.
Or was he from here and joined up?
What?
Did he live in Pennsylvania? Or was
He had gone to seminary in Pennsylvania, and he was down there at that time. Many stories about Chaffin. Two of my favorites. Number one, he was an inveterate explorer as a town historian. Something we're all nosy Parkers, I guess. And after the new water district was established, he went up there to check it out. And they started off with a giant reservoir rather than a standpipe, which was open because you get free water that way when it rained. So he was up there, and then he fell in. Eventually, his cries were heard, and he was hauled out. And one of his Irish friends came to him and said, "Oh, begorra, I never knew we'd be drinking holy water here in North Easton." The other funny story about him was there were a lot of ministers in town, and a parishioner of another minister came in one day huffing and puffing, and he said, "Reverend Chaffin, I went for the priest because my mother is dying, and he was visiting the bishop, and I couldn't get him. So I went to the Methodist man, and he was out fishing, and I couldn't get him. And I tried the congregational minister, and he wasn't there. And he says, finally, after searching all over hell, I found you." On a more serious note, this is the grave of George Searle Shepard, the first boy to die in World War I. The VFW just dedicated the corner of Park and Center Street to him because that's near his house, which still stands down on Center Street. Most of the people here are shovel workers. This is the grave of Joel Randall, whose house was right out in front here. I wonder if he got the plot as part of the deal to put the church there. And then this is the cenotaph, probably. No, actually, I'm actually wrong about that. This is the grave of Ansel B Randall. And basically what he did on April 2nd of 1865, he had become the captain of a company in the 56th Massachusetts Regiment, a regiment that he had helped raise. He was a reluctant soldier. He didn't get into the Civil War until 1862 because he was trying to establish his career as a dentist. And so he was working on his career, finally enlisted because there was a bounty, and he figured he could use the money. He served and got the bug, either the spirit of the Union or the spirit of I love serving in the military, and used his dentist office over in Abington to help recruit the 56th Mass. He was an Easton boy, the son of a shovel worker. The colonel of the regiment was one of these Yankee Brahmin type guys. So on April 2nd, at the siege of Petersburg, which had lasted for months, the Union Army decided on one gigantic attack, and Randall led his men towards Battery 27, which was the key point in the Confederate line. And the men broke through. And what that meant was that the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, had to be evacuated because the Union had just cut off their last railroad escape route and supply route. Sadly, what happened, however, was Randall was wounded in the head and died several hours after the battle was over, and never really learned about that. As I think I may have mentioned in a previous walk, nobody here in Easton knew that. On the day when Lee surrendered, that news got here very, very quickly by telegraph. That was April 9th, a week later. And on the same day, news arrived that Ansel B Randall was the last boy in Easton to have been killed in the war. So when the Grand Army of the Republic was established, just like the VFW named their post after George Shepard and the American Legion, after George Schindler, two boys who died in World War I, they named their post after Ansel B Randall. That's a very good question. The 56th was at the Battle of the Crater and participated in the Battle of the Crater. The problem with Randall was that we don't know whether he was there. On May 6th of 1864, during the Battle of the Wilderness, he had done something terrible to his knee, probably tore all the ligaments in his knee, and could barely walk. So they sent him home to recuperate. He recuperated for a while. He heard some talk, you know, here's a guy, oh, look at this, he's here at home, the other guys are up to the front. So he went back kind of early, and you can imagine him, when he was leading his men across the field on April 2nd, limping along, but he was too dedicated not to be there for them. So he may have missed the Battle of the Crater, which was one of the worst disasters for the Union during the war. I did mention that there's some interesting stories here, and Martha Blaisdell is the wife of Benjamin Blaisdell. Let's see if I get this right. And here's Benjamin, oh, here it is, here, excuse me. This is Sarah over here. Sarah H., wife of Benjamin G. Blaisdell and former wife of Daniel B. Crockett. Okay, which sounds like a story, but it really isn't. Crockett and Blaisdell were guys that worked at the shovel shop. They were skilled people, probably engineers, the guys that ran the water wheels and all of that sort of stuff. And Sarah married them sequentially, but not due to divorce. Daniel Crockett died, and Benjamin got married, and he died. They all died in New Hampshire. The two Blaisdells died in New Hampshire, but they were brought back here to be buried. She's buried between her two husbands, Daniel on one side and Benjamin on the other. You can imagine them arguing through eternity who get the best years of the wife's life. So it's kind of interesting. That's not that rare, but it's rare for this particular cemetery. Just very quickly, we talked about Uncle Cyrus Lothrop. He was the brother of Oliver Ames II's wife, and he's buried here. And it's kind of fun because Cyrus lived in the house next door. He lived in Unity Close, and so he's buried facing Unity Close. He's not really an Ames because he's a Lothrop, so it's your related family. But while almost all the other Ameses are buried over here, if you come around the corner, Mr. and Mrs. Parker, who also lived in Unity Close, are buried on this side of the hill when the rest of the family is buried over there. The reason they decided to do that is they could overlook the house where they had spent their married life. One of their two sons is also buried here. Okay. One of the sons died in World War II and is not buried here. So I think that's kind of nice. I love my house and garden so much. I want to be buried facing that, and the hell with the family over on the other side. So this is the other Parker son. He's buried over here, Amory. Don't know why he's over here and the rest of the family's on the other side. Sheep pasture, Ames's, Oliver Ames, and Elise, his wife, They're the people that sheep pasture was built for. And here's the marker, again, a simple stone provided by the government for Oliver Ames Jr., who was killed in the war, saving Wild Bill Donovan, who went on to become the head of the OSS during World War II. The town is about to dedicate another corner up at sheep pasture for Oliver Ames. So all three of the boys who died in action at the First World War will be having a marker. So we have here the grave of David Ames. David is the father of Bill Ames, Fred Ames, and David Jr., who are the most prominent Ameses still here involved in town. And their mother, Elizabeth, is approaching her 100th birthday in December. We're all praying that she makes it. She's not very well right now. But it would be nice if she made 100. Be the first member of the family to live that long. Up here, we have two of the three Freds. The other Frederick Lothrop, the man who was worth $25 billion back in the olden days and was one of the richest men in New England, is buried over there. His son is right here, and his grandson, Freddie, is here. And just please, if I should ever die in a plane crash, do not put the picture of the plane on my gravestone. Okay? But that's exactly what you see here. This is the plane that Fred Ames crashed. I'm oftentimes asked, is the carving of the sailboat indicative of the fact that Sally Ames, his daughter, was killed in a boating accident? And the answer is no. She was a skilled ocean racer and loved to sail, and they just decided to put that on the marker. So we have the big three buried here. This is the old man, old Oliver, buried right at the center at the top of the hill. I do not know whether this particular gravestone was moved up from the Southeastern Cemetery or whether it was added when the bodies were moved up here, but he's the start of the whole show. His son Oliver II is over here, and then over here is Congressman Oakes Ames, who died in 1873. And there's several ways that you can interpret the column here. The polite interpretation is that he was congressman during the time when the Washington Monument was completed. Okay. The other one is more Freudian. And it was sort of a way for the family to say, hey, we think he was okay. All right. In back of us here, this bronze statue is the grave of Governor Oliver Ames. And here we have the grave of Blanche Ames and her husband, Oakes Ames. And the important thing about that is that this particular grave was actually designed by Blanche. And you can see all their favorite orchids along the outside of this casting. Shows up particularly well on this side right now. The question I often get from students is, are they buried inside here? And the answer is, I don't think so, but it is hollow. So, and if anybody knocks back, I'm going to run. Yeah. But all four sides are different on this one. Now, associated members of the family are also buried here as well. If you follow along coming back up here, I was looking the other day, and looking along here, there's S.A. and there's H.A. right here, okay? H.A. was the brother of Oakes and Oliver. This is Horatio Ames. Horatio, if your family is going to have a black sheep, Horatio is your black sheep. So we're not advertising with a big gravestone that Horatio is here. But Horatio got a divorce. Actually, his wife got a divorce. Why did she get a divorce? Because he was consorting with ladies of the evening in New York City while they were living in in Connecticut. Horatio, to his credit, however, was an iron maker just like the rest of the family, and he actually built the biggest cannon in the Civil War. He built a siege gun that weighed over 19,000 pounds. And he invented a new way of making that so that he challenged the head of the Ordnance Department to a duel with cannons. And what they were going to do was overcharge both cannons, and Horatio would sit on his cannon and the ordnance guy would sit on his cannon. It's tough when the ordnance guy's making his own cannon. And they were going to fire it off, and if one of them blew up, so be it. And if Horatio's didn't blow up, he could make it cheaper and better, et cetera, et cetera. So whether that was true or not, we don't know. If you want to do the family genealogy, everybody's here. All the Ameses apparently, or I shouldn't say all, most of the Ameses come back. John Ames Mitchell, the man who designed the church, is not buried here. His brother is buried here. His brother was shipped home from out west to Philadelphia, where he was embalmed and wrapped in a coffin that had black velvet on the outside, and he's buried over there. This is Susan Ames French, who was Oliver's daughter, Oliver II's daughter. And over here, and I want to show you this one because we have toured his house. This is the one where I don't recommend that you step inside here. You can see this two depressions. Makes me nervous. But this is the stone for Oakes Anger Ames, the man that lived in Queeset House, and his wife, and Queeset House. Yep. I just find this a particularly beautiful stone. Unfortunately, like many stones, you don't know how they're going to age, and so this one has picked up some color, which I'm not sure was intended, but it's a beautiful stone. It really talks about the personality. Dad's up here with this huge, gigantic, whatchamacallit. Here's the guy that ran the shovel company for 30 years, made the family $1 gazillion, and very modest but lovely stone. Very tasteful. He doesn't get credit for an artistic sensibility, but I think this is a great example of a wonderful headstone. So now we are going to carefully turn around and go back. I do want to point out Charles H. Chipperfield. Charles H. Chipperfield was the town baker. If you ever want an open bakery in town, I suggest naming it Chipperfields. It just sounds like a baker's name. Okay?
There's a Williams you mentioned we walked.
Oh, there's Hiram down there, yes. Hiram Williams, the man who owned most of sheep pasture at one point. Took a while for the family to get it, too. The original house was built on a very small, relatively small plot, and then everything was added later. Okay, be very careful on this downslope. So, I'd like to finish with a very, very brief little poem, and it's from Thomas Gray's Elegy on a Country Churchyard, and I think it kind of sums up my view here. As a local historian, I'm interested in all those wonderful things the Ameses did, but I'm also interested as much, maybe even more, in what ordinary people like you and me, unless, by the way, somebody would like to donate $1 million to me here in the crowd, no, okay, would accomplish. And this cemetery points that out. Here they are on the top of the hill, here they are down below, but everybody has a story, and I do want to read this. It says, "Let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure, nor grandeur hear with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor. The boasts of heraldry, the power of pomp, and all that beauty, all that wealth e'er gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. The paths of glory lead but to the grave." So here they are, all together. Thank you.